So I've already pretty much introduced the title of the presentation. It's Human Trafficking, Sex Trafficking Government in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is investigate the history of Saudi Arabia and Iraq's government, establish the divergence and place the focus on hegemonic leadership in each country to expose the rationale for the neglect of sex trafficked victims in the country. So first, I'm going to give you a definition of sex trafficking based on the United Nations, just to kind of lay the foundation so you have an understanding of what sex trafficking actually is and what laws govern it in terms of international law. Also, I'm going to discuss the history and structure of Iraqi government, identify forms of sex trafficking internally and across its borders, and then explore the country's efforts to diminish sex trafficking. And then next, I'll basically do the same thing for Iraq. Okay, so I've basically already told you what the objective of the presentation is. So next, I'm going to go ahead and talk about a little bit about the United Nations and then the definition of sex trafficking. So the United Nations Crime Fighting Office said that 2.4 million people across the globe are victims of human trafficking at any given time. And 80% of those victims that are being human trafficked, they are actually being exploited as sexual slaves. So all right, so now in terms of the United Nations office, on December 23rd, 2005, the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, through the General Assembly resolution, established the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. So this protocol serves as the first legally binding international instrument that adequately defines trafficking in persons without opposition amongst the nations. So I'll go ahead and give you an idea of what human sex trafficking is according to this article. So it's a little, long, so bear with me. Article 3 of the protocol defines trafficking in persons as a recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other means of coercion or abduction, of fraud, of deception, or abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. This exploitation shall include, at the minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexually exploitation, forced labor, services, slavery, or practices similar to, say, slavery, servitude, or the removal of different organs. So that's what Article 3 basically highlights. Further, in my research, I learned in this same protocol that if you have establishment of a definition of sex trafficking, then you're also going to have some repercussions in terms of that. So there, in Article 5 of the protocol, it highlights the criminalization of these acts. So it basically says in Article 5 that Article 5 requires that the criminalization of any attempt to commit the human trafficking offense include any participation, any solicitation with respect to any kind of sexual offense. It also includes directing or organizing others in terms of trafficking, partaking in any form of sex trafficking as well. So as such, it is not mandatory that the legislation of Article 5 be specifically mirrored in terms of member states in the United Nations to enforce these rules in terms of the criminalization of sex trafficking, but it should be adapted in compliance with domestic legal systems to perpetuate the concepts contained in the protocol. So now, in terms of this definition of sex trafficking and then the criminalization of sex trafficking, in order for it to apply, then the countries have to be member states of the United Nations, right? So in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iraq, both states joined as members of the United Nations in 1945. So there we have that. They are in the United Nations, which is good. But, however, although they are member states, that doesn't automatically mean that the protocol applies to them. The countries both have to ratify and or accept the different protocols in terms of different laws and legislations in order for it to apply to their state. So in July of, hold on one second. So yeah, so both states, well, both member states accepted and ratified the protocols, one in 2007 and then the other in 2009. So both of them apply there, okay? So next, I am going to basically discuss Iraq's governmental structure and then kind of give you an idea of sex trafficking in Iraq. All right, so I'll start from the beginning, but I'll be very brief in terms of the history, just so give you an idea of where they are. So they began years ago as part of the Ottoman Empire and was later dominated by British administration during World War I. So then we have 1920, was declared League of Nations mandate under the United Kingdom administration. So then their independence was gained in different stages until they finally became a kingdom in 1932. So they declared themselves or proclaimed themselves as being a republic, although they had, strong men like Saddam Hussein and everything like Saddam Hussein that led the country later on. So I'll fast forward till we get to where the United States invaded Iraq. So under the United Nations Security Council's mandate, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. This was due to their non-compliance with some instructions that they were given from the United Nations Security Council. So they were ordered to scrap up all their weapons of mass destruction and long-range missiles to allow United Nations verification and different inspections, but they definitely did not comply. So from 2003 to 2009, the United States was in Iraq under a mandate based on this council. Then they extended and basically stayed in Iraq under a bilateral security agreement to help provide security to train, mentor Iraqi security forces. So I'll go back just for a second. In 2005, Iraq actually formed their own constitution. So upon forming that constitution, they elected 275 councils of representatives. So kind of like our government here. They're starting to incorporate these things and form those things. That was the first paramount act that led to the transition in their constitution over a half a century. Later it took them to get there. So then as time progressed, they held different elections and things of that nature, and then their COR, the Council of Representatives, expanded to 328 representatives. So with the eradication of authoritarian rule in Iraq and the establishment of a republic form of government, Iraq was presented an opportunity to reform. So the ratification of the Constitution in 2005 was their first development in achieving democratic stability. So the formation of the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government under the unicameral multi-party system surfaced very quickly after that. So soon after the United States military, they began to, kind of leave. But with all that being said, in terms of where they are, they have a parliamentary democracy, the prime minister there now. So there's I know I said a whole lot in terms of their government and the structure, and it was, I try to be brief and sum it up because there's a whole lot that goes into it. But with all of that being said, Iraq has gone through a whole lot in terms of their governmental structure and then the transition that they've made. So that brings me to my question, with all that going on, what is there being done about human sex trafficking? Because you don't really hear so much about it, especially with the rise of ISIS and then the ISIL groups now. They're formulated and they're establishing these different domains where they're moving, and that's where we see a whole lot of the human sex trafficking. So approximately 10,000 women and girls in Iraq have been abducted or trafficked for sexual exploitation, prostitution, and even ransom. So there are over 14,000 women and children, men included, that have been killed as a result of this. And the war does play a big role in this, and even with a lot of them going to nearby countries, Syria, and different things of that nature, they also factor in. So there is also different isolated cases where young women have undergone hymen reconstructive surgery in order to be sold off as virgins to get more money. Up to $20,000 is what some of these individuals are paying for this. So women and children are trafficked by various means. So I'll go ahead and give y'all an idea of what it means to traffic, because we all know, we're in law school for the most part, there has to be an act, right? what does that act mean? So that includes the threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse, power of vulnerability, or giving payments or benefits to persons in control of the victim. Once the victims are under the control of the traffickers, the latter also utilize these means to maintain power, control over the victims. Outright force includes abduction, kidnapping, rape, sexual assault, physically detaining the people, beating, torture, and y'all pretty much get the idea of that. So all those things factor in terms of those acts. What is it that is actually being done in terms of trafficking these persons and even harboring them? Okay, so as I mentioned just briefly before, ISIS and the ISIL groups, they have been, it's been like a whirlwind in terms of trafficking and the things that they're doing with their power and the move, right? So they've introduced and legitimized the practice of sex trafficking on an unprecedented scale. Like, it's really increased in terms of that. So before ISIS really, began to emerge and they really had some power in 2015, Iraq was actually making certain strides in terms of imposing legislation to prevent sex trafficking. But now with the shift of ISIS, it's kind of like no real, attention is being given to those victims who have been sex trafficked. Okay, it's just a few images or different people. The image that is to you guys is, let me make sure you guys is left over here is women that are in jars. And I know that's probably crazy to think of that, they weren't actually being shipped in jars, but that's kind of how it is. It's like they're kind of packaged off and they're being sold as if they were some kind of good. So next, I've pretty much kind of highlighted the sex trafficking that is occurring in Iraq. So this basically just kind of highlights, and I won't read through all of it, but it basically says that the government has not reported, in 2014 was one of the reports for the trafficking of persons, has not reported any efforts to investigate, prosecute, or convict human trafficking offenses during that period. So they're really not doing anything to really try and prevent this from happening. Although, as I said initially when I started, in Article 5 of the protocol that I mentioned, that they are supposed to be enacting this legislation on a domestic level in order to criminalize sex traffickers in those acts, but they aren't really doing anything in regard to that. So next I'll give you a brief description of Saudi Arabia government structure and sex trafficking that's occurring there. So Saudi Arabia, their government there is a monarchy-style government. So they have a king there, which leads me to the whole hegemonic rule and the power that lies in the king. So women are very underrepresented there. They have no real voice. There's not suffrage there. They don't have rights to vote or anything of that nature. But the government in Saudi Arabia is based heavily on Sharia law, okay? Now, with that being said, there isn't any law that they've enacted there that prohibits sex trafficking. Okay, although, like I said before, they are ordered to do so under the mandate from the United Nations in that protocol under Article 3 and then Article 5. But in terms of Sharia law, being that they're so heavily, rooted, or their government is based on Sharia law, you would think that they would be trying to do something, because although it's not explicitly stated that sex trafficking is a crime based on Sharia law, but it's implicitly stated, or it's implied in terms of, the idea that there's all different forms of sex trafficking, but there's these sexual acts that are happening outside of wedlock or outside the confines of marriage, which is totally forbidden out there, or is forbidden there. And also, in verse 33 in chapter 24 of the Quran, it illustrates the point that persons should not be forced or they're made into prostitution when they have a desire for chastity, and so that they may prosper in life. So that is another thing that's inside of the Quran, but it's not explicitly saying that no sex trafficking, but it's saying that they shouldn't be, prostituted, they shouldn't be held against their will. And even in terms of marriage, that's a way that they try and slide it in terms of sex trafficking. They'll marry off these children to these men. And then because they're married, it's almost like, okay, well, it's okay. Well, in the Quran, it states that persons should not be forced against their will into these marriages. So that is another thing that would be contrary to the Sharia law. And you would think that it would have some kind of influence in terms of, how they are approaching sex trafficking, but nothing is really being done. So that brings me to the next point, which is who is victimized. So there's people you wouldn't believe. In Saudi Arabia, there's the surrounding areas or the surrounding countries, there's a lot of people being victimized in and out of the countries, but they actually, they're Saudi princes. So the princes there, because they have this role in this government, when I mentioned the monarch-style government, they actually recruit a lot of young men, a lot of boys from the United States. And they promise them modeling gigs, and different things of that nature to come over, and they come over and they're brought to these palaces, and then they have actual confines in the palaces that are, quarters basically for these victims to be harbored there. And based on the government there, I mean, the prince, he has the last say so in his in his palace. So whatever he says goes. So all these things are being hidden, and they're being drugged and everything like that. And then they make these promises. Passports are being taken. So now they're being held there against their will. There was a report done. I'll go to this. A report done by a political reviewer of a Middle Eastern woman. She shares her views on sex trafficking, and it highlights that she, believes that a lot of women suffer from sex trafficking or become victims of different, aspects of trafficking in Saudi Arabia because they are, poverty-stricken, or their families are owing, debt, and they have no choice but to be, sold off for those reasons. And then the bad part about it is now that they've been sold off and they've been exploited in that way, now they are unclean, I guess you could say, because it's forbidden, like I've already discussed. So now they are being killed by their family members, the men in their families, brothers, cousins, fathers, and things like that, because what they've done, it's shunned. So now these are called dubious honor killings. So now it's kind of like they can't really win. They go and then they're trying to provide for the family because that's all they know to do. And then they come back and then, or if they're even able to come back, then they are being killed. So this basically just talks about what I've already kind of reflected on in terms of there not really being anything done in terms of prosecution for these individuals. And when I talked about the governmental structure, being that women are underrepresented and they have no voice there in Saudi Arabia anyway, then the men, it's like, well, they don't have anyone to answer to, really. They are able to do what they want to do, and because of, the king there is not enforcing the law according to the United Nations and the protocol that they are actually under, then nothing is actually being done about that either. So in short, in terms of my, hypothesis, and when I started doing the research, I was like, okay, well, these countries, you hear all kinds of different things. They're, known for their abundant resources and things like that, in terms of in terms of oil and things of that nature, but you never really hear a whole lot about this issue. And I was interested to see how, the different countries, how their governments influence how they would approach sex trafficking. I actually thought that I don't know why, but I thought Saudi Arabia would actually be doing more. That was just what I guessed. I was like, well, because of ISIS going on in, Iraq and, ISIL, then maybe they would actually be pushing because they don't have that issue. But that totally wasn't the case. Although ISIS and ISIL have, been on a rise in power in Iraq and the surrounding areas, the country is still, based on that parliamentary democracy, trying to actually enforce legislation and things like that to prevent sex trafficking, although they are not being very successful at this particular time. But on the contrary, Saudi Arabia is not doing anything. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. I wanted to ask if y'all had any thoughts. I'll just kind of briefly, raise the questions y'all can answer if you want. If not, the first is, do you believe that there is a causal link between the war in Iraq and the increase in sex trafficking? How so? I kind of already highlighted this if y'all are paying attention. But the next question is, do you think enacting more stringent laws in each country will deter the gross proportion of sex trafficking, or is it a waste of time with the rise of ISIS? So anybody can answer.
Well, I had actually a different question.
Oh, if you have a different question, then feel free to ask.
Okay,
a question.
all right, but I'm going to touch on that. So it seems to me that the sex trafficking that goes on in Iraq and in that area is motivated differently than the sex trafficking that goes on in Saudi Arabia. And the reason why I say that is because in ISIL, for ISIL, the sex trafficking is also used as a way of recruiting more young men to join. Hey, if you join, you'll get paid. You'll get paid. You'll have a sex slave, and we just want you to fight for us. Whereas it seems as if the sex trafficking that happens in Saudi Arabia happens more among the nobility or the royals, finding sex slaves to further exploit. So it seems like the motivation that happens with the sex trafficking is different in both those arenas. And given that that Saudi Arabia is ran like a monarchy, it seems more that they're adopting more of a westernized type of culture, at least in some of the major metropolis areas. So when I look at sex trafficking, when you look at sex trafficking through that, would it be that stringent laws would actually help in that kind of environment in Saudi Arabia, where the people who are the rule makers are the ones who are breaking the rules, and in a place like ISIL, where in areas that are controlled by ISIL, where they're now trying to establish this government, and now they're making money. They're making money off of that as a major financial motivator, I would say.
Okay, so this is my thought, and I hope it's responsive to your question. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I do think that, my answer to this, I don't think that more stringent laws necessarily will actually deter individuals from committing these crimes, because, I mean, right now they're supposed to actually enforce laws in general, and they're not doing it. They're not being, reprimanded for it. They're still basically doing what they want to do in terms of, me kind of outlining Article 3 and then Article 5 of the protocol. So with that being said, they're not even following that law. So to enforce more laws. So I don't feel like the enforcement of the law would be the actual thing that would deter them in Saudi Arabia. And then also in Iraq, I've already discussed that they have actually enforced laws. I think that's kind of, and I know the situations are totally different, and you pointed it out, and you're totally right. But they have been enforcing some laws there, and nothing is actually being done. And then in the other country, Saudi Arabia, none are being enforced, and nothing is being done there. So I feel like there needs to be, something else has to be done. That's the whole point of kind of, I guess, making it known or bringing it to light to see how do you think that can work? Because enforcing more laws is not necessarily the answer. And we can see that on one side and we can see that on the other side, that it really hasn't really made a difference in that respect. So.
It seems like it's it seems like it's a global problem. It's the same thing that you're seeing with Boko Haram in, Nigeria? Boko Haram, and it's just very interesting to see how various countries and their governmental structures and how they deal with sex trafficking. Thank you. What I wanted to do was make sure that we got a picture.